Hello, my name is Graham Mercer. I built Mercer Holdings from nothing, and tonight I'm in an ICU awake, counting my breaths. I woke to the metronome of a heart monitor and my daughter's whisper, "You're useless now." I didn't argue, I pressed record. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and comment your thoughts below. Type 1 if you resonate with this story. I woke to the metronome of a heart monitor and my daughter's whisper, "You're useless now." I didn't argue, I pressed record. The room was refrigerator cold, blue numbers breathing across the monitor like a small tide. Rain stippled the window. I tracked the rhythm of my own breath and counted backward orientation by habit. Name, place, time. New York Presbyterian ICU Bay, 3:10 a.m., May 28th. Ava stood at the foot of the bed with a folder and a fixed smile that never reached her eyes. Beside her, Colin's cufflinks caught the fluorescent light. He was already holding a pen, the way men hold leverage. 2 signatures, he said, as if ordering coffee. Temporary power of attorney, and a straightforward medical leave resignation to keep the markets calm. I turned my head until the cervical pillow resisted. "Dr. Park," I said, voice dry but level. "Please confirm my orientation out loud for the chart." She stepped closer, checked pupil response, asked the 3 standard questions, and spoke clearly, patient-oriented X3. The charge nurse recorded the time. The phone in my palm screen dark, kept listening with the mute diligence of a stenographer. Ava's smile thinned. "This is a formality. Investors hate uncertainty. Your legacy will be intact if we don't drag this out." "Legacy," I said, "is just governance that outlives you." I let the sentence sit. She took it as stubbornness. "Sign," she whispered, leaning in, so her perfume replaced the smell of antiseptic. "Or step aside. You're useless now." I repeated the date, the time, the names. It sounded like prayer, but it was chain of custody. "No," I said, keeping my voice even. "Not today." Colin's pen hovered, then retreated. The nurse asked them to step back for vitals. Ava rolled the folder closed with a practiced flick and stared at the ceiling like it had offended her. I closed my eyes long enough to picture section headings from a document I had written years ago. Charter Paragraph 4G, drafted on a longer night than this one. A schedule of irrevocable proxies coupled with an interest executed September 15, 2022. A supplier name, Northbridge Logistics, that didn't belong in any honest chain. Dr. Park finished her checks and dictated into the tablet-oriented X3, "No acute delirium, hemodynamically stable." "If you're declining to sign," she said, professional and unhurried, "I'll note that you understand the decision. Please also note I said that I was presented with documents and declined without sedation." She nodded the way careful people nod once. When they were gone, I lifted the phone enough to see the red dot. The file name time-stamped itself as if a clerk were typing in the corner. I encrypted and sent it to Lydia Brooks with the line we had agreed, "Needed no flourish, ICU duress, 0528.m4a." Her reply landed fast, ASHA 256 hash, the chain of custody number, and a short instruction that read like a friend's hand on the shoulder, "Logged, keep moving." I asked the nurse to initial a witness note that I had refused under no medication, and no confusion. She printed a label with the time. Paper settles disputes the way debates never do. I texted Noah from the hospital portal because it bakes metadata into the message headers. "Freeze any authority changes," I wrote. "No auto-release purchase orders without my wet signature. Flag anything referencing Northbridge Logistics." He answered with a single word, "Done," and a second message already seeing a dormant PO with a condition tied to interim leadership. The word choice told me what I needed. Someone had taught the system to bend to personnel instead of process. Lydia's next message arrived as a draft board resolution, citing bylaw February 2.4 authority to call a special meeting and a clean Delaware-compliant EGM notice template. We penciled a record date where it would cause the most honest kind of trouble early enough to close the book, late enough to catch anyone who hadn't read the small print. June 5th. She added a line about an affidavit of service and left the rest blank. Some fields should only be filled once. Ava returned near shift change, Colin pacing behind her like a metronome set too fast. She spoke to the nurse instead of to me, which was a mistake. How long until he's coherent enough to make a decision? The nurse equal parts polite, and Iron glanced at the chart. He is coherent. I watched Ava do the math and find the answer disagreeable. We're trying to protect the company, she said now to me. Narratives get away from you if you let them. Then don't let them, I said. Start with the truth. She exhaled through her nose, the way she did at 12, when checkmates surprised her. You taught me to move early, she said, and for a moment something like sincerity crossed her face. Then it was gone. They left with the folder unopened. I lay there and let the machines draw their small constellations in green. The ceiling was the same ceiling as any ICU tiles pretending at order. I pictured the auditorium at level 34, the registrar desk, the feel of ballot paper, sturdy, unglamorous, decisive. You don't fight in those rooms. You read, you motion, you vote. You leave behind minutes that are harder to burn than reputations. I drafted a message to IT with Lydia on copy-enabled journaling for finance. Duplicate backup for the CFO's accounts. Widen the net to catch personal aliases that forward company mail. The reply came back with timestamps and checkboxes. It was good work. It would be enough. Before dawn folded into morning, Dr. Park returned. Pain level, she asked. Manageable, I said. One more favor, please say the words, patient was oriented X3 out loud again, and note the time. She did, and the nurse wrote 0322 beside it. The recorder was still in my hand. It was almost imperceptible, the sense that something had shifted, until you looked at the paperwork. Then it was obvious. I closed my eyes and recited a single sentence under my breath, not for effect, but because it belonged in the room. Charter power for G. Golden share. Not enough to reveal the mechanism, just enough for a listener to understand that rules existed before ambition did. If Ava had been there, she would have heard the hinge creak. There are days when power walks in wearing cufflinks. There are others when it arrives in the mailroom or on a nurse's clipboard or in a footer that reads Affidavit of Service. Your legacy is the sum of those footers. My phone vibrates, an internal email from CFO Trent Holloway, interim leadership recommendation, with a leaked BCC list and the wrong timestamp for notice. A second beep EHR update confirms orientation, X3 at 0322. Paper trails just started. I didn't rush out of the ICU. I moved pieces quietly until the board itself favored me. The consult room off the ward had glass that blurred the hallway into gray shapes. It was good enough for work that needed witnesses, but not an audience. Lydia's face lit the tablet in front of me. The camera angled so all you could see was her eyes and the corner of a statute book. She spoke in sentences that had edges. We reviewed a draft board resolution authorizing a special extraordinary meeting under bylaw, or 2.4. Dates and verbs mattered more than adjectives. She logged the draft to our secure vault and attached a clean Delaware-compliant notice template with blanks left for time, place, and agenda. We penciled a record date where pressure would do honest work. June 5th. She would circulate a company-wide litigation hold and collect acknowledgments, no shortcuts, no oral promises that vanish in heat, by June 8th. Hospitals make you think in lists. So I made one and sent it in 3 messages: governance operations evidence, governance the resolution, the notice the certificate to lock the shareholder roll on June 5th. Operations no authority changes without my wet signature. Procurement freeze above a set threshold. Any exception documented with my hand on the page. Evidence preserve finance mailboxes. Turn on journaling and widen capture to any alias forwarding corporate traffic. Lydia wrote back with the language for the hold. HR inserted distribution groups. Legal cued the affidavit of service skeleton that would, when the time came, fix our notice in the world where objections die. Noah took the second message without commentary. He understood tools. Within an hour, the change freeze memo hit the right inboxes with my name at the bottom and a simple line that made administrators sit up. This directive shall remain in force until rescinded by the chairman. He wrote separately to say, IT had flipped journaling for finance and routed audit logs to a restricted bucket. The head of IT added timestamps and a 1-page enablement log that read like a clean receipt. The first flag surfaced before lunch, a pending purchase order, $12.4 million, to Northbridge Logistics. The object had a trigger I disliked on principal auto-release contingent on interim leadership. Systems that obey people instead of policy invite the wrong kind of improvisation. I asked Noah for a screenshot and saved it to the vault with the same care you save family photographs. He replied with something he didn't bother to dress as reassurance. We'll need to talk about who wrote that rule. In the afternoon, I took a call that didn't need video. 2 anchor shareholders, both from the years when we still held board meetings, in rooms with carpet that fought our chairs. We had signed irrevocable proxies together on September 15, 2022, coupled with an interest the kind that survives pressure and headlines. I reminded them of the trigger, an attempted hostile transition, conducted by defective process. I didn't ask them to act. I asked them to do the harder thing, wait, and let the record date close the book. They understood. If you build something long enough, you learn the value of the word sit. The hallway outside was quiet enough to hear the printer on the nurse's station clip out labels. Dr. Park stopped in, checked my chart, asked how the pain was. Manageable. She didn't pry into board mechanics because people who are good at their jobs don't pretend to be good at all jobs. I told her I would need one thing later, a line in the EHR that the patient remained oriented X3 when he reviewed governance documents. She said she would make sure the record spoke in full sentences. I spent the evening teaching the system to say no. The policy portal took my new rule without complaint. Any attempt to change reporting lines titles or capital commitments above the freeze cap would now generate a hard stop, requiring my physical signature. The point wasn't drama. The point was that a signature has weight. If you could lift it, you deserved the move. Lydia's litigation hold went out at 7 p.m. sharp, with a banner that made managers flinch. Immediate legal preservation required, and a link for digital acknowledgement. She CC'd me on the running tally. We watched the numbers tick upward in a neat column: finance operations, procurement, executive support. I told her to send a personalized preservation notice to Trent Holloway, our CFO, and to include his personal devices under the company's BYOD policy. She wrote it in language that would make a vice chancellor nod. IT scheduled a snapshot for morning and sent me the work order number. Miguel texted late pulling thread on Northbridge. Patterns soon. He didn't send PDFs at night. He sent forecasts. I pictured his whiteboard arrows, dates, round dollar amounts arranged like constellations, and thought about how easy it is to confuse momentum with inevitability. Ava was betting on the first. I was counting on the second. I slept a little, the kind of sleep you take in installments. In the morning, the enablement log hit the vault neat enough to make a prosecutor smile. Journaling engaged for finance. Retention extended. Alert rules cloned to prevent tampering. Checksum of initial baselines. Noah forwarded a short note from procurement. Someone had attempted to push the Northbridge PO to pre-clear through a maintenance window. The rule refused. Logs recorded the attempt, the user, and the time. Nothing inflames patience like a paper trail you didn't write. At midday, Lydia brought the text of the EGM notice into focus. Agenda items were not eloquent. They were exact: 1 proxy validation and record date confirmation, 2 review of Northbridge agreements and related party exposure, 3 CFO position. We left the location line as our auditorium on level 34 and the hour at 9. She would fill the service details when the mailroom was ready to swear. By afternoon, I could feel the freeze bite. The company hums change pitch when administrators stop improvising. My badge still opened the ward door. It did not need to open anything else. Ava would interpret the quiet as absence. She'd be wrong. Quiet is often the cost of getting the angles right. Miguel's first pattern map landed just before 5, a single slide that made the air feel denser. Round dollar invoices clustered around private one-on-one meetings between Trent and Colin. Overlaid on the dates were tiny notes, pallet percent repeated on days when Northbridge billings spiked. The slide didn't accuse anyone. It just pointed, like all good evidence does, and let you walk there yourself. I thought about chess the way I did when Ava was 12, and still believed every problem had a tactic. The tactic was simple: build a cage and hold the key. We had the resolution framework, the record date queued for June 5th. The notice language waiting like a sealed envelope. The hold acknowledgements climbing toward our June 8th. D. To catch a shark, you don't thrash the water, you clear it until it has nowhere to hide. The 4th of June began with signatures that didn't look like drama preservation notices, routed through legal auto-acknowledgements landing in a tidy ledger. Lydia pushed finance to the top of the list and included language that wrapped personal devices under our BYOD policy. It moved like surgeon's gloves on tools counted. They imaged Trent Holloway's phone and laptop under MDM-logged checksums and raised journaling capture to ingest side accounts and forwarding rules. The work order number read like a chain link. I saved it. I prefer questions to accusations because questions stay on tape. In a small conference room with a door that didn't quite seal, we sat 3 across a table, Lydia, Trent, and me. One-party consent recording. The tiny red LED winked at the edge of my legal pad. I let silence do the first minute of talking. Then 2 questions, the only ones that mattered. Who authorized the auto-release rule conditioned on leadership status? He looked at Lydia, then at the table. He mentioned a change window, a cross-functional need, a vague we. I asked the second, what does pallet percent denote? The pen clicked in his hand. The air thinned. According to Colin's timeline. He began, and Lydia, without lifting her head, wrote 3 words in the margin: conflict of interest. Afterwards, I walked the notice mechanics with Lydia, the way climbers check knots. Record date first. June 5th, because Delaware cares about order. Then notice not less than 10 days out. Quorum and vote thresholds to be read into the minutes at the start of the meeting. She drafted the affidavit shell for service names addresses method and left the signature line empty. The mailroom would fill it. That's their battlefield. We fixed the agenda to 3 items: 1 proxy validation and record date confirmation, 2 review of Northbridge agreements and related party exposure, 3 CFO position. No adjectives, no speeches baked into the text, only verbs that bind. Miguel sent a text with a location pin to the cafe across from HQ. We took a corner table. He drew with words PO dates plotted against private one-on-ones between Trent and Colin. Round dollar clusters, amounts that look innocent until you stack them flared after their meetings. On those same days, pallet percent appeared in Trent's notes like a watermark. If it's a code for kickbacks, he said it's lazy, which helps us. He sipped his coffee and added almost apologetically, "We'll tighten it with transfer paths. Give me 48 hours." Back at legal, the server cage hummed a constant answer to questions no one wanted to ask. The BYOD snapshot completed. IT filed the report with hashes and a custody trail, the kind of document a vice chancellor reads and then stops reading because it's competent. Lydia forwarded preservation notices to 2 vendors adjacent to Northbridge, the sort of polite tap on the shoulder that makes inboxes feel heavier. The Northbridge address auto-responded with a generic thank you and a footer that listed a P.O. box. We already had their wire instructions. On June 5th at 08:15, I signed the record date certificate. The registrar countersigned. The book closed in a click that only 2 people in the building heard. I felt the weight shift the way sailors feel, wind before a sail snaps full. That afternoon, NOAA confirmed procurement gates were still holding. Someone had tried to push the Northbridge PO through a maintenance back door. The rule refused, and the audit log, now twice mirrored, captured user timestamp and the exact failure string. Bad policy makes loud noises. Good policy leaves paper. June 7th, 10:00 a.m. Lydia walked the EGM notice to the mailroom, the service list attached like a prayer roll. She read the time and location into a memo for the minute book and watched the clerk stamp each envelope. The affidavit of service sat unsigned on the counter like a promise we intended to keep 3 hours later. When the last envelope disappeared into a canvas sack, Lydia signed, the clerk notarized, and the affidavit became a fact. On the sidewalk, I called Miguel. He was already ahead of me. "Money arrows are taking shape," he said. "Your pallet percent days correlate with a billing staircase. I'm following where the steps lead." He didn't say where, not yet. He understood the economy of words. Say the minimum, prove the maximum. At dusk, I replayed the meeting with Trent through the recorder's tinny speaker. 2 questions, 2 silences, 1 slip. You don't need confessions when procedures point. Record date locked. Notice served. Quorum language rehearsed in my head so I could speak it in a single unbroken sentence when the time came. Across the river, the city glittered like a spreadsheet, cells lit, cells dark, everything adding up. Miguel's forensic extract landed just before midnight, a 5-page spine with exhibits. Northbridge had wired a consulting retainer to Drake Venture SPV 48 hours before Trent's interim leadership email. The transfer memo line was dry as drywall, which made it better. The money arrow finally pointed at Colin. I printed the digest, signed the chain of custody sticker, and slid it into a folder marked for the minute book. Facts do not care how late it is. Ava blasts a company-wide note special meeting in 48 hours to remove Graham. Attached endorsements from 2 independent directors. Both text me within minutes. They never signed. An extraordinary meeting isn't won by speeches. It's won by notice, record date, quorum, and minutes. At 09:00, the clock on the back wall rolled to the hour, and I gavelled once, not for drama, for the record. The auditorium on level 34 had the hush of a courtroom. Counsel table to my right, registrar desk, ahead ballot scanners asleep under their plastic guards. Lydia stood spine straight and read into the minutes authority, under bylaw, or 2.4, to convene this extraordinary meeting. Affidavit of service proving the June 7th notice was served in proper form and time, and the record date certificate executed June 5th. The registrar rose, next voice clear enough to cut paper quorum, present holders of a majority of the outstanding shares in person or by valid proxy. I repeated the voting thresholds for the transcript so no one would pretend not to know them later. I recognized Ava for a point of personal privilege. She wanted speeches. I offered procedure. Points will be ruled as they arise, I said, and nodded to the secretary, who dated the line where my ruling would live. We moved to business. Item 1, I said. A motion regarding a purported special meeting circulated by Ms. Mercer. Lydia handed me the text. I didn't need it. I move that the so-called special meeting be declared null for lack of notice and reliance on forged endorsements. The room didn't change temperature, but eyes did. I asked the two independent directors to stand. They did, hands steady, and stated under oath that they had not signed the documents used to solicit support. The secretary collected their affidavits and marked them Exhibits B and C. You could hear the scratch of the pen. You could hear what wasn't said, too. Ava asked to respond. I allowed a minute. She spoke about narrative continuity, investor confidence. None of those words exist in a bylaw. Your father is not well. She finished softer than I expected. The company needs certainty. I nodded once toward the registrar. Certainty was why we were here. Before the vote, Lydia summarized the chain one more time for the record authority. Bylaw, FARBA 2.4, and Board Resolution Notice, June 7th, with an affidavit record date June 5th, quorum as announced, and the legal effect of forged signatures in proxy materials. I overruled 2 points of Order 1 about the order of agenda, 1 about the admissibility of the affidavits, and instructed the secretary to capture my rulings verbatim. The ballot scanners woke with a quiet hum. Ballots on Motion 1, I said. The registrar watched the totals coalesce. The seconds felt like the slide of a bolt. He handed me the tally. I didn't smile. Motion 1 passes. 62% for. No applause. Just air moving again, like a room that remembered how to breathe. The centerpiece of Ava's gambit fell, not in headlines, but in minutes. We pivoted to the table that decides close fights proxies. I asked the registrar to read the validation roll. He announced the boundary in a voice that made it law any proxy dated after the June 5th record date was excluded from count. The recalculation ran like a slow tide across the room. People who had believed their paper mattered realized it had become decorative. Lydia then introduced the schedule of springing proxies irrevocable, coupled with an interest executed September 15, 2022, with the trigger language entered word-for-word activation upon an attempted hostile transition conducted by defective process. She handed the schedule to the secretary, who labeled it Exhibit E, and to the registrar, who adjusted his tally. I could feel the weight shift, the way you feel a ship correct its course. Ava tried another angle whether springing proxies were fair. Lydia didn't answer with adjectives. She cited the charter, the Delaware cases, and the fact that the proxies were disclosed to the board when executed and are lodged with counsel to this day. Fair, she said, is often a synonym for not in my favor. The court reporter we hire for meetings like this smiled without looking up. A shareholder from the back asked about the agenda. I recited it again: proxy validation and record date confirmation, review of Northbridge agreements and related party exposure, CFO position, clean verbs, no theater. I recognized Trent for a question. He declined, eyes fixed on the registrar's screen, as if numbers might blink and change their minds. They don't. We took 2 more points of order, both about whether the forged endorsements could be cured after the fact. They cannot. The secretary logged my rulings. The registrar closed the roll, and the room lost its appetite for improvisation. Rules were not the pretext here. They were the point. I made a note, ink not pixels, that the sealed evidence pouch containing originals of the affidavits and notice proofs would remain under the Secretary's custody for potential court use. We broke for 2 minutes while the scanners went back to sleep. When we resumed, there were fewer shifting feet. Before we proceed to the remaining agenda items, I said the chair recognizes counsel to frame the next presentation. Lydia stood crisp as a filing deadline. Per item 2, she said we propose a factual presentation by our independent forensic accountant concerning vendor relationships and payment flows. I table motion 2, invite Miguel Ortiz to present a forensic extract regarding Northbridge Logistics and Drake Venture SPV. All eyes pivot to Colin as the lights dim and the first slide cues. Truth doesn't shout. It balances ledgers, and then the room goes quiet. The house lights dimmed a fraction, and the projector came alive with a low hum. I stayed standing, because chairs make statements you don't intend. Proceed, I said, and Miguel took the aisle with a thumb drive, and no adjectives. Slide 1 landed on the screen, dates across the bottom, round dollar invoices, as clean dots, a thin regression line that didn't care who was in the room. The dots swelled after private one-on-ones between Trent and Colin. A second series, small square markers, sat exactly on those meeting dates, annotated with a 2-word tag that had started as a curiosity palette %. Numbers like to find their friends. Slide 2 tightened the view. The dots weren't just big. They were clustered as if someone had learned the rhythm of our procurement system and taught a vendor to dance to it. Slide 3, same cadence this time, against internal calendars, the one-on-ones at 11:30, the spikes at 13:00. Everyone knew what the pictures were suggesting. I didn't help them with the words. On slide 4, Miguel overlaid approvals with the auto-release condition. A small footnote at the bottom of the workflow release on change of leadership interim qualifies. It wasn't illegal code. It was opportunistic design policy, bent around a noun. Proximity is not causation, Miguel said, and let slide 5 do the part he wouldn't. The wire advice from Northbridge, a consulting retainer to Drake Venture SPV, timestamped 48 hours before Trent's interim leadership email. The memo line was vanilla. That's the thing about paper used for the wrong purpose. It tries to look boring. I asked exactly one question, because the record prefers economy. Mr. Holloway, define pallet %. He leaned toward the mic, then away from it. 9 seconds felt like a winter. It's contextual annotation, he said finally, and the transcript would capture only the words, not the vacancy around them. Lydia wrote 2 lines for the minute book responses, non-responsive, counsel to advise, and closed her pen with a click that sounded like a seal. Slide 6 returned to system design, the procurement rule that tied PO release to interim leadership. Miguel traced the branch that should have been a gate, and wasn't. This is the line, he said, where an external party's receivable became sensitive to our internal titles. He stopped there. Forensics is a better witness when it doesn't enjoy itself. We did not move to speeches. We moved to motions. Lydia Rowe's expression, the same one she used in front of judges. Motion to remove Mr. Trent Holloway from the office of Chief Financial Officer for conflict of interest and breach of fiduciary duty. To appoint Mr. Noah Patel to exercise interim authority over finance pending independent investigation. I repeated the voting threshold aloud for the record and signaled the registrar. Ballots went through the scanners like steady rain. A minute later, he passed me the tally. 67%, for I said. The badge came off Trent's lapel. The secretary collected his devices and handed him a preservation receipt. There was no spectacle. There was only compliance. We recessed for counsel advice, 5 minutes executive session scope, limited to legal instruction. No structural votes in that room. The secretary wrote that sentence into the minutes before we stood. When we returned, I asked Lydia to read the engagement letter from the independent forensic firm. She did name and hourly rate, and the line that matters full access to records personnel and devices under litigation hold. I signed as chair. The registrar witnessed. The secretary logged the SHA digest of the forensic packet we would transmit. Next, I said, governance stabilization. I placed a memo on the lectern where the camera could see it. Per Charter 4G, the golden share is hereby activated for 90 days to freeze structural changes pending the outcome of the investigation. I read the trigger condition into the record attempted hostile transition conducted by defective process, and the scope, no amendments to control provisions, no changes to capital structure, no leadership reassignments except those expressly tied to the investigation and approved by the chair. Ava stood to object overreach and optics and the market, and Lydia met her with text instead of tone. The trigger was validated by motion 1, she said, and the charter controls. The room understood. Ambition negotiates. Charter does not. A shareholder asked whether finance would function under interim authority. Yes, I said. Continuity is an operations problem. Integrity is a board problem. We are solving both. Noah nodded once. He knows how to inherit a mess without making it a story. We took compliance as its own item. Counsel warned on the record against spoliation. She read the penalties in a voice that would have made a fire marshal proud. The secretary distributed device preservation receipts to 3 names, besides Trent's. I asked the registrar to note that any attempt to alter retention policies would be treated as a point of order at the next session. The scanners slept again. The room's temperature had dropped 3 degrees without the thermostat's help. People think that's fear. It's actually relief rules had stepped in, where personalities were trying to live. I looked over the floor and saw calculators where faces had been. We returned to numbers because endings should rhyme with beginnings. Miguel summarized his last 2 slides for the transcript, no conclusion labels, just arrows. He restated the distance in hours between the Northbridge retainer and the interim email, then the distance in minutes between one-on-ones and approvals. I thanked him for the work and asked him to lodge the packet under seal with the secretary. He did, offering the hash like a key. I called for any last points of order related to agenda items 2 and 3. There were 2. We dispatched them, 1 with a citation, 1 with a calendar. The secretary captured my rulings verbatim. I directed that Colin furnish devices and calendars for expedited discovery by end of day. Lydia repeated the deadline aloud. The cameras caught the first hairline crack in his composure. It wasn't much. It was enough. We paused for 10 minutes, stretchwater council huddles. People talk about adrenaline after moments like this. I've always disliked the word. What I felt was alignment. Minutes matching facts. Facts matching the choices we would be held to later. The boardroom is not a theater. It's a ledger. Balance it and move on. In a short recess, Ava slides a draft NDA settlement she'll withdraw hostilities if her title remains, and Colin is kept out of public filings. I close the folder. We don't bargain on violations. Reporters gather beyond the glass. The executive lounge outside the auditorium still held the echo of cameras and shoes. Ava set a thin folder between us, the paper already creased, where doubt had pressed it. "We can put this away," she said. "NDA limited settlement, no names in public filings. Keep titles as is." I slid the folder back across the table. We don't bargain on violations. Lydia was already at the doorway, with a clean copy of the resolution's punctuation checked like stitches. Back in session, counsel read Resolution A into the minutes, formal reprimand for misrepresentation and attempted forgery. 60-day suspension from CSO duties. Shareholder rights intact. Non-interference with operations. The secretary marked the effective time to the minute. Resolution B followed formation of a special committee, independent directors only with authority to retain outside counsel and oversee an investigation with full access under litigation hold. I repeated the vote threshold aloud, then the tally. The room didn't react. The record did. Lydia handed me a one-sentence press note we had drafted the night before, and I read it as written, "We repair systems. We don't humiliate people." Behind the glass, reporters settled, as if the word repair had lowered the room's temperature. 6 days later, Wilmington had the gray of a ledger. The vice-chancellor ran a tight calendar. The courtroom moved like a clock you could hear. Lydia stood at counsel table and made a simple request with complicated exhibits, a temporary restraining order, preliminary injunction, Far Drake Venture SPV flows, preservation obliga expedited discovery devices, calendars, side accounts. She handed up hashes and chain of custody logs, not adjectives. The vice-chancellor glanced once at the digest, once at the minutes from our EGM, then signed. Order granted. The clerk read a spoliation warning into the transcript, slow and exact. Collins stared at the page as if it might blink. His counsel leaned in and asked for a cooperation framework. Lydia nodded without giving anything away. Provide devices for imaging within 72 hours, she said. Calendar exports, wire confirmations, and a declaration under penalty of perjury. We'll talk after you comply. On July 15th, the boardroom felt like sunset, a light that forgives nothing. We took up the special committee charter first line by line, then a strengthened whistleblower policy with direct channels to the committee chair. Finally, the succession plan within the 90-day golden share window, already activated under Charter Paragraph G. Noah continues as interim CEO for continuity. I remain executive chairman with oversight of strategy. Any structural changes require special committee clearance. The secretary logged cadence for committee reports bi-weekly, with public summaries that said exactly enough. After the vote, I asked Ava to step onto the terrace where air could do part of the talking. The city below arranged itself like a balance sheet. I played the ICU clip a single time, only the sentence that had cut through morphine and monitors. She watched the screen, then the skyline. Regret, I said, is not a speech. It's a calendar and a consequence. She didn't argue. She didn't apologize. She nodded in a way that meant she finally understood order wasn't a tone. It was paperwork with teeth. The investigation moved in straight lines once the court order set the edges. Devices arrived in sealed bags. Imaging receipts came back with checksums that matched. Deposition notices went out to Trent and Colin with dates everyone could read. Miguel supplemented his packet with transfer paths and cross-references. Outside counsel set up a war room where facts could be boxed and labeled. We added Ava's acknowledgement of her suspension to the minute book. No flourish, just a signature at a particular time on a particular date. By then, the market had begun to treat us like what we were, acting like a company that prefers procedure to spectacle. We didn't court headlines. We kept promises. The order held. Accounts stayed frozen. Procurement rules obeyed policy instead of people. The special committee asked colder questions than I would have, which is why committees exist. When I slept short and hard, like a man who has delegated correctly. There was no grand finale, just weight settling where it should. The vice-chancellor set deposition schedules on the record. Lydia color-coded obligations and deadlines. Noah ran a tight operations stand-up and didn't mention crisis once. In the hallway, staff stopped using the word interim as if it were a forecast and started using it like a fact, bounded by dates. That was victory enough for July. The day ended on the same terrace where it had turned earlier. The city's glass went orange, then steel. Ava stood beside me, hands on the rail eyes, on the seam where river met skyline. "I can make it right," she said, not fighting the air, not negotiating the terms. "You can start," I said. "The rest is earned, stamped court order, and enacted resolutions, locked the boardroom, and the balance sheet. Accounts frozen, devices preserved, special committee, empowered, Ava signed acknowledgement." There were no raised voices, only paper, with effect. Order isn't loud. It's dates, signatures, and minutes that outlast tempers. I walked from a deathbed insult to a boardroom where facts held and shortcuts paid their price, and my daughter learned that regret isn't a speech. It's deadlines that bite and terms that hold. Justice rarely shows up on time, but when it arrives, it lands like a final chord, and the room knows what to do next. If you ever stand where I stood, fight clean, document everything, and let procedure carry your weight.